In the burning heart of a distant desert world, beneath the glow of twin suns, a draconic traveler believed she had finally found peace in her hidden oasis. But when a human exile appeared with a claim to the very same land, their fates collided in a storm of mystery, deception, and choices that would change them forever. This is not just a story of survival, but of trust, betrayal, and the power of an unexpected alliance. If you are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video, and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's jump into the story. The twin sons of Orevan 9 were beginning their slow descent toward the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of copper and deep orange. The light stretched across endless dunes of crystal sand, each grain catching the glow like fragments of glass. The desert was vast, silent, and unbroken, except for the jagged cliffs and the rare oasis that shimmered like a hidden jewel. It was here, at the edge of one such spring, that Lyran Duskwing had built her sanctuary. She was draconic, tall and powerful, her scales glimmering with an iridescent sheen that reflected the dying light. Her wings, folded neatly against her back, were vast membranes of color that resembled stained glass when touched by the sun. She had left her homeworld years ago, seeking solitude among the stars, and had purchased this land believing it would grant her peace. The oasis was more than water. It was life. The minerals within the spring nourished her scales and restored her strength. Here, she could be herself, far from the noise of spaceports and the greed of mining colonies. As she stepped into the warm water, a low sigh rumbled from her chest. The liquid wrapped around her body, soothing and familiar. Her wings spread across the surface like giant lily pads, catching the last rays of the suns. For 3 cycles she had lived here, believing she was alone. She had paid dearly for this land, trading years of work as a translator for the galactic trade routes. The deed had promised her privacy and ownership of the surrounding territory. She trusted the silence of the desert to guard her secret. But she was not alone. Hidden high in the cliffs above, a man watched her every movement. His name was Dorian Hale, a human who had come to Orevan 9 6 months earlier. His face was weathered, marked by years of hardship under alien suns. He wore simple clothes, practical and worn, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes. Dorian had fled Earth after a failed marriage and a ruined business. He had invested the last of his fortune into what he believed was worthless desert land. The deed he carried told him the oasis was his. For days, he had observed the strange creature who bathed in what he thought was his spring. At first, he had been angry, ready to confront her. But anger had given way to fascination. Lyran moved with a grace that seemed impossible for her size. Her scales shimmered like living jewels, and her presence filled the oasis with an otherworldly beauty. Dorian told himself he should act, should demand answers, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the peace she carried, or perhaps it was the loneliness that had weighed on him for too long. The desert was silent, except for the sound of water rippling around her wings. Dorian adjusted the scope of his lens, unable to look away. He had seen recordings of draconic beings before, but nothing compared to the reality before him. She was not just a creature. She was a story, a living reminder of worlds beyond his own. Suddenly, Lyran stilled. Her head lifted, nostrils flaring as she tested the air. Her golden eyes narrowed, sharp and knowing. Her voice carried across the oasis, calm yet commanding. She told him she knew he was there. She spoke of his scent, of the traces of his sweat and the bitter coffee he drank each morning. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. Dorian froze. His heart pounded in his chest. He had been discovered. He could run, vanish into the desert, or he could face her. After a long pause, he chose to step forward. Slowly, he left the shadows of the cliff and began his descent down the carved steps that led to the spring. Lyran watched him approach, her gaze steady and unblinking. She did not cover herself or retreat. Her people had no shame in their form. Her scales were her armor, her culture's pride. When he reached the edge of the water, she spoke again. She told him he was trespassing, that this was her land, her sanctuary. Dorian removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. His voice was steady, though his chest still raced. He told her the same thing. He claimed the land as his, purchased legally, with proof in his pocket. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Two strangers, both believing they owned the same piece of paradise, stood face to face for the first time. The suns dipped lower, casting long shadows across the oasis. The water shimmered between them, reflecting the tension that filled the air. Lyran's wings rustled, sending ripples across the spring. Dorian held his ground, his eyes locked on hers. Neither spoke for a long moment. The desert wind whispered across the dunes, carrying with it the weight of their silence. This was the beginning of something neither had expected. A clash of ownership, a meeting of solitude, and the spark of a story that would change them both. Beneath the twin horizons of Oravon 9, the desert had brought them together, and neither would leave unchanged. The desert night was falling over Oravon 9, and the twin suns had slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the sky painted in deep violet and streaks of fading gold. The oasis shimmered under the dim light, its waters glowing faintly, as if holding the last memory of the day. Lyran Duskwing stood tall at the edge of the spring, her golden eyes fixed on the human who had dared to step from the shadows. Dorian Hale, weary and cautious, faced her with a mixture of defiance and unease. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the soft ripple of water against stone. Lyran's voice carried across the oasis, calm yet edged with authority. She told him this was her land, her sanctuary, purchased legally from the colonial authority 3 cycles ago. Her wings shifted slightly, sending small waves across the pool, a subtle reminder of her strength. Dorian did not flinch. He removed his hat, his weathered face revealed in the fading light, and replied that the land was his. He had bought it 6 months earlier, with documents that bore the seal of the government. The air grew tense. 2 strangers, both certain of their claim, stood locked in a standoff. Lyran narrowed her eyes, her pupils contracting into sharp slits. She demanded proof. Dorian reached into his shirt pocket and unfolded a sheet of smart paper. The document glowed faintly, displaying coordinates, signatures, and the official seal of Oravon 9's colonial office. Lyran stepped closer, her scales catching the dim light, and studied the paper with suspicion. After a long pause, she turned toward the rocky ledge where her belongings rested. From a small carrier, she retrieved her own deed. It was older, dated 3 years past, and bore the same seal. She handed it to Dorian, her expression unreadable. He examined it carefully, noting the authenticity of the markings and the accuracy of the coordinates, yet the dates and boundaries did not match his own. Dorian exhaled slowly, his voice steady but edged with frustration. He told her they had both been deceived. Someone had sold the same land twice, perhaps many times, exploiting those desperate enough to seek solitude in the desert. Lyran's tail swished across the sand, a sign of her agitation. She admitted she had come here to escape the noise of other worlds, to find peace away from all species. Dorian nodded, confessing he too had sought refuge, far from the failures of his past life. The clash of ownership was no longer just about land. It was about pride, survival, and the fragile hope each carried. Lyran's voice softened, though her eyes remained sharp. She asked what he intended to do now that the truth was clear. Dorian hesitated. He had dreamed of this oasis as his final refuge, a place to rebuild his life. Yet here stood another soul, equally determined, equally wounded by betrayal. The desert wind swept across the dunes, carrying with it the scent of minerals and the faint hum of distant storms. Lyran folded her wings tightly against her back, her gaze fixed on the human. She told him she would not leave. This spring was vital to her survival, its minerals essential for her scales. Dorian replied that he too would not abandon the land. It was all he had left after losing everything on Earth. Their words clashed like steel, yet beneath the sharpness lay an unspoken recognition. Both were victims of the same deception. Both had been drawn to the desert by the promise of solitude, only to find themselves entangled in conflict. The night deepened, stars emerging across the sky like scattered diamonds. The oasis reflected their light, turning the water into a mirror of the heavens. Dorian studied Lyran, noting the strength in her stance and the weariness hidden in her eyes. She was not just a creature of myth. She was a being who carried her own burdens, her own longing for peace. Lyran, in turn, regarded Dorian with cautious curiosity. He was human, fragile compared to her kind, yet there was resilience in his posture. He did not cower, nor did he lash out recklessly. Instead, he stood firm, a man shaped by hardship and loss. The clash of ownership had not been resolved, but something had shifted. The desert itself seemed to demand patience, as if testing whether they could endure one another. Lyran finally spoke, her tone measured. She suggested they search for answers together, to uncover who had deceived them both. Dorian considered her words, the weight of the desert pressing on his shoulders. He agreed, though reluctantly, knowing trust would not come easily. The oasis, once a symbol of solitude, had become the center of a fragile alliance. Two strangers, bound by conflict, now faced a shared mystery. The desert of Oravon 9 had revealed its first secret. The question of ownership remained unresolved, but the path forward was clear. They would have to walk it together, whether they wished to or not. As the night settled fully over the land, the water of the spring glowed softly under the starlight. Lyran and Dorian stood on opposite sides of the pool, their reflections shimmering side by side. The clash of ownership had begun with anger and suspicion, but it was leading them toward something neither had expected. The desert was not finished with them. It had only just begun to weave their fates together. The dawn rose slowly over Oravon 9, casting long shadows across the desert dunes. The twin suns painted the horizon in pale gold and crimson, their light spilling over the jagged cliffs and the shimmering oasis below. Lyran Duskwing stood at the edge of the spring, her wings folded tightly against her back, her golden eyes fixed on the human who had disturbed her solitude. Dorian Hale stood opposite her, his hat in his hands, his face lined with fatigue and determination. Both had claimed the land as their own, and both had discovered they had been deceived. The night before had ended with tension and silence. Neither had yielded, neither had left. Now, in the cool light of morning, the desert demanded a decision. Lyran's voice was calm but firm as she spoke. She told Dorian that the oasis was vital to her survival. The minerals in the spring restored her scales and gave her strength. Without it, she could not endure the harsh climate of Orevan 9. Dorian listened, his jaw tight, before replying that the oasis was his last chance at rebuilding a life. He had lost everything on Earth and had come here to start again. Their words clashed, but beneath the sharpness was a shared truth. Both had been cheated. Both had been drawn to the desert by promises of ownership and peace. Liren studied Dorian carefully, noting the weariness in his eyes. He was not a conqueror or a thief. He was a man broken by loss, clinging to the same hope she carried. Dorian, in turn, saw in Liren not just a creature of myth, but a soul who longed for solitude and healing. The desert wind swept across the dunes, carrying with it the faint scent of minerals and the whisper of distant storms. Liren finally broke the silence. She suggested they investigate who had deceived them. If both deeds were false, then someone had profited from their suffering. Dorian hesitated, his instinct urging him to remain alone, but he knew she was right. The truth would not be found by standing still. They agreed, reluctantly, to travel together. The uneasy alliance began with silence as they prepared for the journey. Dorian packed his worn satchel with water and rations, while Liren gathered her belongings with precise movements. When they set out across the dunes, the suns were climbing higher, their heat pressing down on the land. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of shifting sand and jagged rock. The journey was not easy. The heat was relentless, and the dunes rose like waves, each one more difficult than the last. Dorian struggled against the weight of the sun, his clothes damp with sweat. Liren moved with greater ease, her scales reflecting the light, but even she grew weary under the endless sky. Yet neither complained. The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer hostile. It was the silence of endurance, of two strangers bound by necessity. As the day wore on, they encountered the dangers of the desert. A sudden storm rose from the horizon, the wind whipping sand into the air, until the world vanished in a haze of gold and red. Dorian shielded his face, stumbling forward blindly. Liren spread her wings, creating a barrier against the storm, guiding him through the chaos. When the storm finally passed, Dorian looked at her with quiet gratitude. She said nothing, but her eyes softened for a moment before turning back to the horizon. That night, they camped near a rocky outcrop. The stars stretched endlessly above them, brighter than Dorian had ever seen. He sat by the small fire they had built, staring into the flames. Liren sat nearby, her wings folded, her gaze fixed on the sky. After a long silence, Dorian spoke. He told her of his life on Earth, of the failures that had driven him here. His voice was steady, but the pain beneath it was clear. Liren listened, her expression unreadable. Before sharing her own story, she spoke of leaving her homeworld, of seeking peace among the stars, and of the loneliness that had followed her. Their words did not erase the tension between them, but they built a fragile bridge. Dorian began to see Liren not as an intruder, but as a companion in exile. Liren, in turn, began to see Dorian not as a rival, but as a fellow wanderer. The uneasy alliance was still fragile, but it was no longer empty. The next day, they reached the ruins of an abandoned colonial outpost. The structures were crumbling, half buried in sand, but traces of technology remained. Inside, they discovered records of land sales, documents that revealed the truth. The same territory had been sold multiple times to different buyers, each deed altered slightly to appear unique. It was a scheme designed to exploit those desperate enough to seek refuge in the desert. Liren's tail lashed against the sand in anger. Dorian clenched his fists, his voice low with frustration. They had both been victims of the same deception. The clash of ownership had been built on lies. Now, the question was what to do next. As the suns set once more, casting the desert in shades of fire and shadow, Lyran and Dorian stood side by side at the edge of the ruins. The uneasy alliance had carried them through storms, silence, and revelation. They were no longer strangers, though they were not yet friends. The desert had bound them together, and the path ahead was uncertain. Beneath the twin horizons of Oravon 9, the uneasy alliance was only the beginning. The desert had tested them, and it would test them again. But for the first time, neither stood alone. The suns of Oravon 9 were setting once more, their twin lights casting the desert in shades of fire and shadow. The dunes stretched endlessly, glowing like molten glass beneath the fading sky. At the edge of the oasis, Lyran Duskwing stood with her wings folded close, her golden eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside her, Dorian Hale adjusted his worn hat, his face lined with exhaustion and thought. They had uncovered the truth of their deception. The land had been sold to both of them, a cruel trick played by corrupt brokers. Now the question remained, what would they do next? The ruins of the colonial outpost lay behind them, half buried in sand and silence. The records they had found proved beyond doubt that neither of their claims was secure. The deeds were real in appearance, but false in intent. The land had been sold many times, each document altered to lure desperate buyers. Lyran's tail swished across the sand as she considered the weight of the discovery. Dorian clenched his fists, his voice low, as he admitted that everything he had left in life had been tied to this place. The desert wind carried their silence, whispering across the dunes like a reminder of the choice before them. Lyran spoke first. Her voice was calm, but carried the strength of her people. She told Dorian that she would not abandon the oasis. The minerals in the spring were vital to her survival. Without them, her scales would weaken and her body would fail. Dorian listened, his jaw tight, before replying that he too could not leave. The oasis was his last chance at peace, his final refuge after losing everything on Earth. Their words clashed like steel, but beneath them was a shared truth. Both had been broken by the past. Both had come to the desert seeking solitude and healing. Now the desert had bound them together, forcing them to face one another. Dorian looked at Lyran, seeing not just a draconic traveler, but a soul who carried the same longing he did. Lyran studied Dorian, recognizing in him the same weariness that had driven her across the stars. The suns dipped lower, their light reflecting across the surface of the spring. The water shimmered like liquid fire, a mirror of the tension between them. Dorian finally broke the silence. He suggested they could fight for the land, each claiming their right until one yielded. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the weight of the thought. Lyran's wings rustled, sending ripples across the pool. She told him that such a path would only destroy them both. Instead, she offered another choice. The oasis, she said, did not need to belong to one alone. It could be shared, not as rivals, not as enemies, but as guardians. Dorian frowned, uncertain. He had dreamed of this place as his own, a sanctuary where no one could disturb him. Yet as he looked at Lyran, standing tall and resolute, he realized the desert had already changed that dream. Solitude was no longer possible. The desert night began to rise, stars appearing one by one across the vast sky. Dorian thought of the storms they had endured together, of the silence they had shared by the fire, of the truths they had spoken beneath the endless stars. He realized that the desert had already bound their fates. To fight her would be to fight himself. Slowly, he nodded. His voice was quiet but firm. He agreed to her pact. The oasis would belong to neither of them alone. It would be a sanctuary, a place of peace for any who sought refuge. Lyran's eyes softened, her wings unfolding slightly as if in approval. She told him that the desert had tested them, and together they had endured. The choice beneath the twin suns was made, not through conquest, not through ownership, but through compassion. The oasis would stand as a symbol of shared hope, a reminder that even in the harshest of worlds, understanding could be found. Dorian felt a weight lift from his chest, the burden of loneliness easing for the first time in years. Lyran felt the same, her heart steady as she realized she was no longer alone in her sanctuary. As the night deepened, Lyran stepped into the spring once more. The water glowed softly around her scales, reflecting the starlight above. Dorian sat at the edge, watching in silence. For the first time, he did not feel like an intruder. He felt like a part of something larger, something shared. The desert of Oravon 9 stretched endlessly around them, vast and unyielding. Yet within its silence, a new story had begun. Two strangers, once divided by conflict, had chosen a different path. The oasis was no longer a prize to be claimed. It was a sanctuary to be protected. Beneath the twin suns, the desert had given them a choice, and together they had chosen hope.